There are bloodlines in America that were never meant to survive. Hidden in the mountains of Kentucky, buried beneath decades of silence and shame, lies a family tree so twisted, so grotesquely intertwined, that when you see it mapped out, your mind will struggle to comprehend what you're looking at. This is the story of a man who didn't just break the laws of nature, he shattered them completely. A man who married his own granddaughter and created a genetic nightmare that still haunts the American landscape today. His name was Charlie Fugate, and by the time he died in 1975, he had become something that shouldn't exist in the natural world, the most inbred human being ever documented. But Charlie wasn't born a monster. He was made into one, generation by generation, through a family practice so disturbing that even hardened geneticists refuse to discuss it publicly. What happened in that Kentucky hollow wasn't just incest, it was the systematic destruction of human DNA itself. You think you know about family secrets. You think you've heard the worst stories about what happens when bloodlines turn back on themselves. But you haven't, not until today. Because what the Fugate family did to themselves over the course of 200 years created something that modern science still struggles to explain. They didn't just marry their relatives, they engineered their own genetic apocalypse, one wedding at a time. The records were hidden for good reason, the photographs were buried. The truth was locked away in medical files that were never meant to see daylight. But the evidence remains, scattered across dusty courthouse records and faded hospital charts, telling the story of America's most inbred family. And at the center of it all was Charlie Fugate, a man who looked at his own granddaughter and saw not an abomination but a bride. The Fugate story begins in 1820, when a French orphan named Martin Fugate arrived in the isolated hills of eastern Kentucky. He carried with him a recessive gene so rare that medical textbooks barely mention it, a mutation that would turn human skin the color of a winter sky. Martin married Elizabeth Smith, a red-headed woman from the local settlement, and together they disappeared into the hollows where civilization ended and something darker began. What Martin didn't know was that Elizabeth carried the same cursed gene. When two carriers of this mutation reproduce, their children don't just inherit a rare condition, they inherit a mark that sets them apart from the rest of humanity forever. The first Fugate children were born blue, not the pale blue of oxygen deprivation, but the deep, unnatural blue of something that was never meant to walk this earth. The condition had a name, methemoglobinemia, but the mountain people who witnessed it had simpler words: devil's children, cursed blood, the blue people. And in the isolation of Troublesome Creek, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away and the nearest doctor was a day's ride through treacherous mountain passes, the Fugates learned to survive by turning inward. They married their cousins because there was no one else. They had children with their siblings because isolation had made them desperate. But what started as survival became something more sinister. The Fugates discovered that when they bred within their own bloodline, the blue color became more pronounced, more permanent, more defining. The children born from these unions weren't just blue, they were something else entirely. And instead of seeking help from the outside world, instead of diluting their cursed genetics with fresh blood, the Fugates made a choice that would echo through 7 generations. They decided to embrace the curse. They decided to make it stronger. By 1880, the Fugate family tree had become a genetic horror show. Brothers married sisters. Uncles took nieces as wives. First cousins produced children who were so inbred that their DNA looked more like a closed loop than a branching tree. But the Fugates weren't done. They were just getting started on a journey into genetic hell that would make them infamous in medical circles for all the wrong reasons. The third generation brought new horrors. Children born with mental disabilities so severe they never learned to speak. Infants who lived for weeks in agony before their malformed organs finally gave out. Physical deformities that local midwives refused to describe, even to their own families. The blue skin was now the least of their problems. The Fugates were creating human beings who were barely human at all. And yet they continued. Generation after generation, they chose family members as marriage partners with a consistency that bordered on religious devotion. The isolation of Troublesome Creek had become their excuse, but the truth was darker. The Fugates had developed a twisted pride in their uniqueness. They saw their blue skin not as a curse, but as a mark of distinction. They believed they were special. They believed they were chosen. The outside world began to take notice, but not in the way the Fugates expected. Traveling preachers whispered about the devil's work in the mountains. Government officials received reports of children so deformed they couldn't be classified as fully human. Medical researchers started making the dangerous journey into Fugate territory, not to help, but to document what they found there. The Fugates had become a living experiment in human genetic degradation, and they were too isolated, too proud, and too damaged to understand what they had done to themselves. By 1900, the genetic damage was irreversible. The Fugate bloodline had become so concentrated, so toxic, that every child born carried multiple recessive genes for conditions that most people never even knew existed. They weren't just inbred, they were genetically poisoned by their own ancestry. Into this genetic wasteland, in 1912, Charlie Fugate was born, but calling it a birth doesn't capture the horror of what actually happened. Charlie emerged from his mother's womb already bearing the accumulated genetic sins of 6 generations. His skin wasn't just blue, it was a deep indigo that made grown men cross themselves when they saw him. His eyes held a vacancy that suggested something fundamental was missing from his humanity. His body was twisted in ways that defied medical explanation. Charlie's parents were first cousins who were themselves the products of brother-sister unions. His genetic makeup was so compromised that modern geneticists estimate his inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of laboratory mice bred specifically for genetic research. In simple terms, Charlie had less genetic diversity than animals created intentionally to be genetically identical. He wasn't just inbred, he was genetically collapsed. The local doctor who delivered Charlie later wrote in his private journal that the child looked more like something dredged from the depths of hell than a human baby. But the doctor's horror didn't stop there. As Charlie grew, it became clear that his physical deformities were only the beginning. His mental development was so severely stunted that he never progressed beyond the cognitive level of a young child. He couldn't read, couldn't write, and could barely communicate in anything more complex than grunts and gestures. But Charlie could reproduce, and in the isolated world of Troublesome Creek, where the gene pool had already been poisoned beyond repair, that was all that mattered. The Fugate family looked at this genetically destroyed creature and saw not a tragedy, but a continuation of their bloodline. They saw him as a potential father for the next generation of Fugates. They began planning his marriage before he even reached puberty. The woman they chose for him would make the previous generations of Fugate inbreeding look tame by comparison, because the family had run out of distant cousins and second-generation relatives. They were down to the closest possible genetic matches. They were down to immediate family. In 1930, Charlie Fugate married his own granddaughter. Her name was Bessie, and she was 18 years old when the family arranged this genetic atrocity. But the true horror isn't just that Charlie married his granddaughter, it's that the family treated this as a normal, even necessary continuation of their bloodline. The marriage ceremony was performed by a local preacher who had been paid enough to keep his mouth shut. The wedding was attended by family members who saw nothing wrong with watching a grandfather take his granddaughter as his bride. Think about what this means genetically. Charlie was already the product of 6 generations of intense inbreeding. His DNA was so compromised that he barely qualified as genetically human. And now he was reproducing with someone who shared not just some of his genes, but nearly all of them. Bessie wasn't just his granddaughter, she was his genetic mirror image. Their children would be born with a genetic similarity so extreme that it violated every principle of human reproduction. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have had the courage to break the cycle, or would you have been trapped by the same isolation and twisted family loyalty that doomed the Fugates? The children that came from this union were beyond medical classification. They were born with conditions so severe that even hardened mountain doctors refused to treat them. spinal deformities that left them unable to walk, facial malformations that made speech impossible, internal organ arrangements that shouldn't exist in nature, and through it all, that distinctive blue skin that marked them as Fugates, now deeper and more unnatural than ever before. But the true measure of Charlie's genetic destruction wasn't visible on the outside. It was hidden in his blood, food in his bone marrow, in the very structure of his cells. Medical researchers who studied the Fugate family in later years discovered that Charlie's DNA showed signs of genetic breakdown that they had never seen in human subjects. His chromosomes were damaged beyond repair. His genetic code was collapsing in on itself like a dying star. When geneticists finally gained access to the Fugate family medical records in the 1960s, they discovered something that challenged everything they thought they knew about human genetic limits. Charlie Fugate's inbreeding coefficient measured at 0.67, a number so extreme that it shouldn't be possible in human populations. To put this in perspective, a child born to full siblings has an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Charlie's genetic similarity to his own ancestors was nearly 3 times that level. Dr. Madison Cowain, the hematologist who first studied the Fugate family medically, later described Charlie's genetic profile as something that belongs in a laboratory, not in nature. The concentration of recessive genes in Charlie's DNA was so extreme that he carried genetic markers for dozens of rare diseases simultaneously. His body was essentially a museum of human genetic disorders, all compressed into one barely functioning organism. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't what Charlie had inherited. It was what he was passing on. Every child born from his union with his granddaughter carried the accumulated genetic damage of 8 generations of inbreeding. Their DNA looked more like a genetic experiment gone wrong than the natural result of human reproduction. These children weren't just suffering from the effects of inbreeding, they were experiencing the complete breakdown of human genetics in real time. The medical community tried to intervene, but it was too late. The damage had been done not just to Charlie but to his children and to any future descendants who might carry the poisoned Fugate genes. The family had created a genetic dead end so extreme that modern science still uses Charlie Fugate as a case study in the absolute limits of human inbreeding. Medical students learn about him not as a person, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when human genetics are pushed beyond their breaking point. By the time Charlie died in 1975, he had become something that existed outside the normal parameters of human biology. He was the most inbred human being ever documented, a man whose genetic code had been so corrupted by generations of family intermarriage that he represented the final stage of genetic collapse. Charlie Fugate's death marked the end of something that should never have existed in the first place. But his legacy didn't die with him. Hidden in the mountains of Kentucky, scattered across medical archives and buried in family graveyards, the evidence of what the Fugates did to themselves remains as a permanent scar on American history. The children born from Charlie's union with his granddaughter lived short, painful lives before their genetically compromised bodies finally gave up the fight to survive. The last known carrier of the concentrated Fugate genes died in the 1990s, bringing to an end nearly 2 centuries of genetic self-destruction. But the story doesn't end there. Modern geneticists continue to study the Fugate family tree as a window into the absolute limits of human survival. Charlie's genetic profile has become a benchmark for measuring inbreeding in isolated populations around the world. His DNA samples, preserved in medical laboratories, serve as a reminder of how far human genetics can be pushed before complete collapse occurs. Today, the hills of Troublesome Creek are quiet. The old Fugate homesteads have been abandoned, reclaimed by the forest that once provided their isolation, but locals still tell stories about the blue people who once lived there, stories about children who were born wrong, about marriages that violated the laws of nature, and about a man named Charlie who represented the final chapter in a genetic nightmare that lasted 8 generations. The medical community has learned from the Fugate tragedy. Modern genetic counseling exists partly because of families like the Fugates, who showed the world what happens when human reproduction becomes completely disconnected from genetic diversity. Charlie Fugate's life serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of genetic isolation and the catastrophic consequences of extreme inbreeding. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Charlie's story isn't the genetic horror he represented, it's the fact that he was created by human choices. Every marriage, every birth, every decision that led to his existence was made by people who could have chosen differently. The Fugates weren't victims of circumstance, they were architects of their own genetic destruction, and Charlie Fugate was their final, most twisted creation. He was proof that sometimes the monsters we fear most are the ones we create ourselves.